Martin Thallo shared with me this this article by Popper titled "The Importance of Critical Discussion: An Argument for Human Rights and Democracy." And it is about, human rights and democracy, and critical discussions. It's also about good versus evil, peace, how to achieve peace, and the relations between Russia and the West. Notably, this was written in 1981, so during the Cold War. But I think this still has interesting implications for today, particularly regarding the conflict in Ukraine that I'm going to get to. As you can see here, Popper owned the copyright to this article, so obviously he's dead now. I don't know who owns the copyright today, but I'm assuming his estate or something. If his estate has a problem with me reading this and commenting on it like this, then I have no problem just taking it down immediately, so people can just contact me. In any case, what I want to do is I want to read this to you and then interject and comment whenever I see something worthy of pointing out or commenting on. Okay, so let's start. 60 years ago, a great physicist was born. For the good of us all, he became a great thinker, a great humanitarian, a great hero, and above all, a truthful and truth-seeking. Andrei Sakharov's great achievements as a physicist were acknowledged in 1953, when at the age of 32 he became a full member of the Academy of Sciences. Now, the first thing I want to know, and by the way, I'm going to just comment on anything and everything that I can think of, not just like political philosophy or whatever. One thing in terms of language, he says, he uses the word great, I think 5 times. I wrote it down here. Yeah, 5 times in the first 4 lines. It's a bit repetitive. In any case, let's continue. I suppose that this honor and the other great honors he received were connected with his basic work on the hydrogen bomb. However this may be, like those atomic scientists in the West who founded the famous Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, he became greatly concerned about nuclear weapons. Since 1957, he has dedicated his life to doing everything possible to reduce the most terrible danger to mankind, the danger that is a consequence of the wonderful discoveries in atomic theory, which, due to Hitler, led to nuclear armaments and to the armament race that may so easily bring about the destruction of life on Earth. For his work for peace, and for his dedication to his truly heroic fight for peace and mankind, Sakharov received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975. But it seems that this work, which was inspired as much by his patriotism as by his love for mankind, was difficult for the rulers of his country to appreciate. This was to be expected, and it must have been expected by Sakharov himself, for he had criticized severely and fearlessly the policies of the East as well as of the West, and severe criticism is, understandably, rarely well received by those whose views and whose actions are criticized. Now the supreme importance of criticism and of critical discussion, of free critical discussion, seems to me to be central to Sakharov's thinking. For this reason, I have made the problem of critical discussion the center of this paper. Many of the points I shall make are due to Sakharov, and my other points are such as I hope he would approve of. But since I know nothing of him and of his work, except what has been published in English translation, I cannot, of course, be certain of his approval, and the responsibility for what I'm saying is obviously mine alone. Now, I hold with Sakharov, I think, that there is the most urgent need for criticism, for free critical discussion. This discussion must be free, in the sense that theories ought to be freely proposed and their consequences freely examined. The discussion need not be, and in my opinion should not be, free in the sense that aspersions can freely be cast on those persons who happen to hold a theory that is under critical attack. He's going to get more into this part right here, mentioning the persons are attacking the persons versus the theories they hold, and I have some more things to say about that, but we're going to get to that. There's an almost universal tendency, perhaps an inborn tendency, to suspect the good faith of a man who holds opinions that differ from our own opinions, whether these opinions are religious, scientific, or political. By the way, I found it curious that he used the word suspect here. I kind of stumbled over that. I think he means question. I think he's saying that if somebody holds an opinion that differs from your own, that you question his good faith. And he's totally right. This does still happen all the time. There are so many discussions I've had where if your opinion just differs sufficiently from somebody else's, sometimes they think that the only reason you would hold that opinion is because either you're trolling them or you're crazy or whatever. Like they'll come up with some they'll come up with some reason, anything but that you could be right and they could be wrong. Okay. I think I stopped here. This tendency is admittedly as widespread in the West as in the East, and the only people whose professional education somewhat counteracts this tendency are scientists doing research in the natural sciences. This tendency has been for many centuries the source of religious intolerance and religious persecution, and for these and other reasons we all should combat it strongly and suppress it in ourselves. It obviously endangers the freedom and the objectivity of our discussion if we attack a person instead of attacking an opinion, or more precisely, a theory. We have all to learn to be purists in this matter. It is highly desirable that in a critical discussion the theory to be criticized be clearly and simply formulated and the reasons that speak for its rejection be clearly stated, independent of the motives of those who hold it. Of course, it may be admissible to name a person and to say that he or she actually holds the theory criticized. This is sometimes necessary in order to make it clear that one is not fighting windmills. I had to look this up. Fighting windmills means fighting imaginary enemies. So Popper here is saying that sometimes you have to name the people that hold a theory so that it doesn't come across as you're just criticizing theories that nobody holds anyway. I also notice Popper, I think he does this a bunch of times in this text. He says in order to. I think I remember from using Grammarly a bunch that they recommend just say to. Most of the time it has the same meaning and it's easier to read and understand. Like in this case it would just be, this is sometimes necessary to make clear that one is not fighting windmills. Seems easier than what he wrote. Continuing. But we should never impute motives to those who hold a mistaken theory. After all, each of us makes mistakes, serious mistakes, all the time. We should remember what Voltaire said. What is toleration? Asks Voltaire. And he answers, it is a necessary consequence of our being human and therefore fallible. We are all products of frailty, fallible and prone to error. So let us mutually pardon each other's stupidities. This is the first principle of the law of nature, the first principle of human rights. Voltaire's principle of tolerance is indeed the basis of all rational discussion. Without it, rational discussion is impossible. And it is the basis of all self-education. Without consciously admitting our fallibility to ourselves, we cannot learn from our mistakes. We become infallible dogmatists. It is a credit to the schools in which Sakharov was educated and to the scientific training he received, but above all, to his devotion to truth, that he could change his mind on many points and in a truly critical and revolutionary way. I'm not now speaking about the question of what the result of his change of mind was. This is another question. I'm speaking about the change as such, the ability to change one's mind radically, the difference between a dogmatic mind and a critical mind. Some people are totally inflexible. Some have the ability to change their theories just once. But the ability for critical thinking, for revising one's theory again and again, is unfortunately very rare. It seems to be the result of training, of participation in many free critical discussions, and of self-education. Yeah, I think this part is particularly important, which is why I highlighted it. Also, the people who are totally inflexible, they could be called pigheads. And I think most people are pigheads to some degree. Like there are going to be some things that they're not willing to question or change their minds on. And you have varying degrees of those, and some people are very pig-headed, whereas others are just a little bit pig-headed. And then the people who are very, very open-minded in the sense of like being able to revise their theories, not just once, but more often, and also in any area whatsoever, those are very rare. Okay. However this may be, Sakharov has shown that he has this ability. Even more important, he's been able to change his social and political theories critically, in spite of the fact that he was not helped, but hindered by most of the criticism directed at him. And he has been hindered not only by the actual criticism, but also by his generally precarious situation. Clearly, he was prepared for great sacrifices, and he took great risks. So, something to point out here is that not all criticism is helpful. Not all criticism is a gift. Sometimes criticism can stifle you. And also, particularly in Russia at the time, but I'm guessing also still today, living in that kind of environment, you have to be prepared to make great sacrifices if you want to come up with bold new ideas that go against the zeitgeist and the status quo. In the West, it's easier to do that. Not necessarily easy, but much easier. Continuing. I have read somewhere that Sakharov had been accused of acting in order to be praised in the West. I can only say that, so far as I know, he received far more praise in the West for his older theories than for his later ones. And this cannot have surprised him, for in his later publications he criticized these earlier theories, which had become perhaps the most fashionable among Western intellectuals. He described them as faddist. I wasn't quite sure what this means, but I'm guessing this means like of or relating to fads. So like quick passing fashions, I'm guessing. Thus, he certainly did not think of praise or recognition or fame either in the West, East or in the West. He pursued other aims, the only aims worth pursuing. He tried to get a little nearer to the truth, even though he had to contradict some things he had said before. And he tried to think of what could be done to save his country and mankind as a whole from destruction. These are indeed aims worth pursuing, and they are worthy of a great scientist. A great scientist. The distinction between dogmatic ways of thinking and critical ways of thinking is of great importance. From the point of view of biology, dogmatism corresponds to lack of adaptability, and since life demands constant adaptation to a constantly changing environment, dogmatism, and especially the inflexibility of a society, leads almost of necessity to extermination. Critical thinking corresponds to adaptability. It is, like adaptability, decisive for survival. This point was echoed very much in David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, in chapter 17, where Deutsch writes, static societies eventually fail because their characteristic inability to create knowledge rapidly must eventually turn some problem into a catastrophe. So there's a connection there. Continuing, Darwin might have spoken of the survival of the adaptable rather than the survival of the fittest, or he might have said that the fittest organisms are those that are the most adaptable. So I would be very critical of what Popper wrote here. The stuff that I highlighted in red is stuff that I'm critical of, and the stuff that I highlighted in yellow, more often than not, is just stuff that I think is notable or important. Others have criticized this notion of the survival of the fittest. It's not really a good summary of what evolution is about. Evolution is not about survival, and it's not about the fittest. It also puts the individual organism center stage, when that's not really, like, they're more salient because we can see them, but they're not the unit of replication. The unit of replication is the gene, and evolution is about which genes spread better than their rivals. And spreading doesn't necessarily entail survival. It can, but it doesn't necessarily. It can definitely happen where the spreading of a gene or a mutation of a gene entraps it in a ecological niche, and then the gene dies out completely. All the gene, quote unquote, wants to do is spread as much as possible, like right now. So I would be critical of this passage in particular. Continuing, they are certainly not the biggest or the most powerful ones. Yeah, this I agree with. It's not like the sometimes people misunderstand survival of the fittest to mean like the most physically fit organisms, like the organisms that exercise the most, so to speak, or like are the strongest or have the most muscle or can run the fastest, that those are the ones that will survive. That's definitely not true, not necessarily. On the intellectual level, this means that the most self-critical thinkers, the most imaginative thinkers, the most flexible thinkers are needed by every society of mankind is to survive. Or to use another term, the most revolutionary thinkers are those who can carry out revolutions in their own imaginative minds, those who can try out different revolutions in their minds, compare the results, and choose the best. This is precisely how science progresses. Such intellectual revolutions carried out in one's mind or on paper are obviously far superior, far cheaper, and far more successful than revolutions carried out by killing people. Use words instead of swords. Use tentative theories instead of warheads. This is the method of the intellect. It is not only the humane method, but also infinitely more effective and successful. So something I wrote down here is that sometimes you can see in Popper's writings the seeds of certain libertarian thoughts. So the fact that reason and peace and cooperation are far cheaper and superior and far more successful than violence is the reason that this old notion that man is man's wolf is incorrect. There's this old notion that, if there were no government, and if government didn't use some minimum amount of violence, or if there weren't at least some minimum threat of violence all the time, people would just walk around killing each other all the time. That's just can't be true because of this. And this is also one of the reasons why good is stronger than evil, because good will try to use reason and peace and peaceful cooperation and persuasion over violence whenever possible. Whereas coercion and violence, typically employed by evil, are signs of incompetence. I forget who said that. I forget his name, but there was someone who... it's on the tip of my tongue. But there was someone who said basically that if something is good, it can be shown to be good, and then it shouldn't be hard to persuade others of that. And if you have to force them to comply, then that means that you just don't know what you're talking about. Okay, continuing. It is clearly the method that Sakharov adopted when he gave up forging swords. As a great scientist, he had always used this method even when he was forging swords. Indeed, one can see the history of mankind in many ways, as a war of classes, or as a war of religions or ideologies, or perhaps even as a war of races. But perhaps the most convincing way, as implied by Marx, is to see it as a war between means of production, between more improved and less improved tools and instruments. This, however, would be a war between dogmatic and critical ways of thinking, or between less and more mental flexibility. In history, the less flexible were usually in the majority, and like Louis XIV, or Louis XIV, I don't know how to pronounce it in English, or Napoleon, or Kaiser Wilhelm, or Hitler, they usually had a monolithic and highly centralized organization. Often they even had the first shot. The more flexible ones were often less well prepared, and they were at best an alliance of states in which there were two or more parties competing for power. Nevertheless, it was flexibility, critical thinking, that counted in the end. I don't really know what Popper means here by the flexible ones were at best an alliance of states, because like Kaiser Wilhelm and Hitler also had alliances. It's true that they were not as flexible, but they were also alliances. I don't know. Continuing. What I'm trying to describe as critical or flexible thinking, in contradistinction to dogmatic inflexibility, is simply the method of learning from our mistakes. So, speaking about pig-headedness or lack thereof here, again, this is... Why doesn't this open? What he's saying here is reminiscent of my concept of dynamic versus static minds, which are dominated by dynamic versus static ideas, respectively. So what I did, I basically view the mind as a pool of self-replicating ideas. And because they're self-replicating and because replication isn't perfect, those ideas evolve. And that's how we come up with new ideas, or we can. And what I did is, I think there's two distinct replication strategies. And those are replication strategies that I borrowed from David Deutsch's idea of static memes versus dynamic memes. Now, a meme is an idea that spreads across many people. And David Deutsch, in The Beginning of Infinity, wrote about how memes can have two different replication strategies. Either they're what he calls static or anti-rational. Those are memes that spread because they shut off their holders' critical thinking. For example, certain religious ideas fall under that category. Or you have dynamic, or what he calls rational memes, which are ideas that spread across people because they're useful, they help them. And they thrive in a critical environment, like scientific ideas, for example. So I took those two replication strategies and applied them directly to the mind. And so I think a mind that is dominated by static ideas or anti-rational ideas is going to be very pig-headed. It's going to have a very difficult time changing its mind, literally. And therefore it's going to have a very difficult time learning from its mistakes. Okay, continuing the text. We're all fallible. We're all prone to error. In fact, we are making mistakes all the time. On the biological level, many mistakes occur mainly in the form of unfavorable mutations. And natural selection consists in eliminating these mistakes by eliminating the organism that is the carrier of the mistake. On the human level, dogmatism often means that a man does not learn from his mistakes, but perishes with them. Critical thinking consists in formulating in a human language, and thus outside our skins, our conjectural theories, which are often mistaken, in fact, far more often than not. What I like here is that Popper is very nuanced. He says that our theories are often mistaken. So that implies that they're sometimes correct, or at least they can be correct. Because it seems to, I think it's worth pointing this out, because it seems to me that many of the people who subscribe to Popper's philosophy, whether they really are fallibilists or not, they have taken this a bit too far. They think that we're always mistaken, at least partially, in everything that we do and believe. But then if that were true, then we could be sure that we're mistaken, and that's incompatible with fallibilism. So sometimes we are right. We just don't know when that's the case. This became possible with the invention of human language, of writing, and especially of printing. It allows us to submit these theories and hypotheses to critical discussion, and thus to expose them to the full force of natural selection without danger to us. In fact, we do more. We submit them to the severest tests we can design. We add to the pressure of natural selection, the artificial selection pressure contrived by our cunning. We do so with the help of scientific discussion, in which we appeal to the results of our cunningly designed experimental tests. In this way, we let our hypotheses, our ideas, die in our stead. This is precisely what scientists do. The so-called scientific method is nothing else. It is an attempt to eliminate our many errors of thought, the more the better. It is a form of the method of trial and the elimination of error. It is the way in which we learn from our mistakes and in which we can make fertile our almost always erroneous hypotheses. There it is again. Popper is nuanced. He says, almost always erroneous. For this reason, a real scientist would not dream nowadays of personally attacking another scientist for having proposed a mistaken conjecture, for he knows only too well that almost all our conjectures are erroneous and that they are extremely valuable nevertheless. They are just as valuable as red traffic lights. To criticize the scientist rather than those specific consequences of his hypothesis that are mistaken shows a typically uncritical attitude. So I want to say something about that. So I wonder, I mean, I definitely agree. It's like if say, so we learned, for example, that Newtonian physics is mistaken, but it wouldn't make any sense to hold that against Newton personally. But what if, for example, somebody proposes a theory, and then that theory, like a political theory, say, and then that theory leads to violence and evil? What if that person proposed that theory recklessly, say, or negligently? I think then it does make sense to speak of, like, attack the person specifically, not just the theory. So I think there has to be a way to square what Popper says here with Ayn Rand's imperative to always pronounce judgment and condemn evil. And it's very difficult to condemn evil without mentioning the evildoer by name. It's like there's this essay she wrote, How Does One Lead a Rational Life in an Irrational Society?, where she writes, quote, "When your impartial attitude declares in effect that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you, whom do you betray and whom do you encourage?" So if somebody does evil and you want to pronounce judgment, you should mention them by name, because otherwise they know they can just rely on you. They don't really have to suffer any consequences for doing evil. So, yeah, in the case of Newton, yes, don't hold his mistakes against him. In the case of Hitler, yeah, of course, to hold Hitler's mistakes against Hitler. Also, Popper seems to have, I think he doesn't quite live up to his ideal there, because here on my blog, I quoted Popper. I found it in some tweet, this quote, where he attacks quite personally Adorno and Habermas. So Popper says, quote, "I can only say that when I read either Adorno or Habermas, I feel as if lunatics were speaking. I have translated some of their German sentences into simple German. It turns out to be either trivial or tautological or sheer pretentious nonsense. I completely fail to see why Habermas is reputed to have talent I do not think he was born less intelligent than other people, but he certainly did not have the good sense to resist the influence of a pretentious, lying, and intelligence-destroying university education. End quote. So this is pretty severe criticism directed at the person of Habermas and the person of Adorno, not just their ideas. But to be fair, Popper did write earlier, I did read that sometimes people contradict themselves, but I don't know, he may be being a bit hypocritical here. Okay, continuing the text. It is the typical attitude of religious dogmatism, of pre-critical intolerance, or of religious persecution. In the field of politics, it is a symptom of failing to learn from science the main thing a politician can and ought to learn from it, its ways of thinking critically, self-critically. What is particularly important in this connection is that new hypotheses, new ideas, whether true or false, are most valuable because they're so very rare, and we are always in need of more. We have to wait until they emerge under the pressure of difficult problems or under the stimulus of an exciting discussion. This makes free discussion almost indispensable. We need many new theories, and we need peaceful coexistence between the new theories so that they can compete in order that we can select the fittest, the most flexible, the best adaptable, and the best adapted ones. We need a pluralism of ideas and of theories, and therefore we need a pluralist society. This is exactly what Sakharov tries to propagate. I have no doubt that he is right in saying that this is what his country needs most urgently, but pluralism needs toleration, and this too Sakharov has seen very clearly. We need a tolerant society in order to find among this plurality of competing ideas, of competing theories, the true ones, or those that get nearest to the truth. A pluralist and tolerant society, one in which we can discuss theories freely, is what I described more than 40 years ago as an open society. Obviously, a society can be more or less open, more or less free, but a good measure of freedom or openness is needed, especially if the society in question competes with another, with one that is freer and more open. The idea of freedom became part of our Western history in the 5th century BC, when an alliance of a few tiny democratic Greek city-states succeeded in resisting the colossal might of the Persian Empire. This brings me to the problem of democracy. Since I do not like to speak about the meaning of words, I shall say nothing about the meaning of the term democracy. I shall confine myself to speaking about its merits and demerits, starting with a remark by Winston Churchill. Churchill once said something like this: "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all other known forms of government." I think this is excellently put, yet I still prefer to say that there are two kinds of governments: those you cannot get rid of without bloodshed, and those you can get rid of without bloodshed. Excuse me. I'm an adherent of the second kind, whatever beautiful names you may give to the first and whatever ugly names you may give to the second. By the way, I've written more about Popper's famous Criterion of Democracy on my blog. There's an article called, I think it's called Popper's Criterion is Insufficient, that I recommend if you're interested in like what is democracy and how can we build upon Popper's work on this question. The second kind of government, for brevity's sake let us call it democracy, is certainly not a method to ensure the rule of the wisest or the best, and it has often been criticized for this reason. But only a very unwise person can believe that any method exists that ensures the rule of the wisest or of the best. At any rate, Socrates was certainly right that wisdom consists in realizing our own lack of wisdom. Democracies have serious drawbacks. They certainly are not better than they ought to be. But corruption can occur under any kind of government. And I think that every serious student of history will agree upon consideration that our Western democracies are not only the most prosperous societies in history, that is important but not so very important, but the freest, the most tolerant, and the least repressive large societies of which we have historical knowledge. I have said this before, of course. It would be almost criminal not to say it if one believes it. One must fight those who make so many young people unhappy by telling them that we live in a terrible world and a kind of capitalist hell. The truth is that we live in a wonderful world, in a beautiful world, and in an astonishingly free and open society. Yeah, I agree with him there wholeheartedly. So, maybe I'm violating what Popper said about criticizing ideas and not people, but people like Greta Thunberg and Paul Ehrlich, those are the kinds of people that we have to fight. Continuing. Of course it is fashionable, it is expected, and it is almost demanded from a Western intellectual to say the opposite, to lament loudly about the world we live in, about our social ills, about the inherent injustice of our society, and especially about the alleged terrible inequalities and the impending day of reckoning. I do not think that any of this is true. It is true that there are a few people who are very rich, but what does it matter to me or to you? It is most certainly not true that anyone suffers because a few are very rich, not to mention that quite a few of the few who are rich spend much of their money on such things as founding universities and lectureships and on scholarships and cancer research. Yeah, by the way, I remember a former colleague of mine when I worked at Apple, he was of the opinion that we don't need billionaires. I thought that was ironic, him working at Apple and all. Continue. The truth is that Western democracies are the only societies in which there is much freedom, much welfare, and much equality before the law. Okay, so this notion, equality before the law, I think this is really interesting because, on the one hand, I agree that the notion of equality before the law is really important. Like, it is important that, say, women are afforded the same rights as men. But there are certain parts of the population that don't have equal rights yet, for example, children, and that's bad. There are certain Enlightenment ideals like freedom of association and just, physical autonomy and stuff like that. I think David Oach wrote about this somewhere, that just aren't applied to children yet. They don't have freedom of association because they're put in classrooms with people they may not want to associate with. They don't have physical autonomy because in some states and some countries the police will literally drag them physically to schools, even if they don't want to go. And that's really terrible. But then on the other hand, some equality before the law is actually bad. So, for example, something that occurred to me recently is, why is it that everyone is forced to pay for the legislation and enforcement of copyright, even though very few people are content creators? Like, very few people actually need copyright. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that everything that you write by default is copyrighted. You don't even need to register it. But who, of all the people who write emails, say, or letters, how many people are actually going to enforce that copyright? It's very few. And yet everyone has to pay for that. So that strikes me as a bad situation. Also, equality before the law means that people currently are equally forced to finance legislation that can even harm them, which is even worse. With something like what David Friedman has suggested, those kind of Friedmanian arbitration services, if you will, which are like voluntary capitalist alternatives to our current legal system. Maybe there could be something like, I need to read more about those. I'm still just learning about what he has in mind, but as I understand it, there could be something like, you'd have basic legal packages that you buy or that you subscribe to, just like you have insurance plans, say. You would have legal plans that you subscribe to. And then maybe the base package has all the basic stuff like property rights, and people can't physically attack you. People can't steal from you, that kind of stuff. And if they do, your arbitration service, your legal protection service, whatever you want to call it, they will try to find those people and bring them to justice. But if you're not interested in copyright, say, because you don't think you need it, then you don't have to pay for it. That would be an additional package that you could purchase. And so that way you could put together the legal services that you need. And you wouldn't be forced to pay for things that you don't want or that you don't think you need. And one more thing I want to say about this notion of equality before the law, or our legal system in general right now, is that a big part of what makes a society open and free, but Popper doesn't touch on this here, though I think Ayn Rand does in The Virtue of Selfishness, if I remember correctly, is that individuals are protected from the legislation. It's not just that they are afforded equality before the law, but that actually they are in the law embedded. There are safeguards against abuse on the part of the legislation. It means a civilized society, I think Ayn Rand writes, means, civilized means that the individual is protected from the government, from the legislation. That protection is particularly good in the US. It's not as good as it could be, but it's decent. Like, free speech laws are very good in this regard. It's very difficult for a politician to hold you accountable for what you say if you criticize them, say. So in Germany, for example, I'm not a lawyer in Germany either, but I grew up there, and I know that if you, I think that if you, and I've heard about this, that if you publicly insult, say, a politician, for example, if you tweet an insult at a politician in Germany, it's not at all unlikely that the police will show up on your doorstep. I think that is a very bad law. Not just because it's silly, because those are just words, and it's an insult, grow up. I think unless an insult is part of a larger pattern of verbal abuse or physical abuse or something, the insult shouldn't, there's really no reason for the government or the police to get involved in that. But it also opens up the general populace to abuse from legislation, because now the legislation can just go after people for saying things they dislike, that the legislature dislikes. So I think that's a really bad law, just as an example. Okay, continuing. Of course, our society is very far from perfect. There is much misuse of drugs, of tobacco, and of alcohol, but from our experiment with prohibition, we know that these things are difficult to combat, especially if we cherish freedom. It'll be answered, but these things are just symptoms of the people's unhappiness. They are unhappy about such things as social inequality and unemployment. If by social inequality it is meant that some people have more money than others, then I should say that as long as those others live reasonably well, I don't care. Unemployment is, of course, a very different matter. So, this is, I said earlier that sometimes in Popper's writing you can see the seeds of certain libertarian thoughts. This is one of those passages where in Popper's writings you can see the seeds of certain collectivist thoughts. I'm not sure what he's calling for regarding unemployment here. I don't understand why he thinks that's a different matter. Is he saying that someone who is unemployed has a claim on the money and life of someone who is employed? Because that would be very bad. Like Ayn Rand says, we are not our brother's keepers. We are each responsible for our own lives. We're free to help people voluntarily, of course. So that's one way to tackle unemployment. Or at least deal with it. Yeah, so then he continues, I'm very much aware of the fact that unemployment is a terrible thing, a real social ill, the most terrible of all social problems. I certainly do not know how to cure it, but of one thing I am sure, it is an ill that every democratic government would not only wish to cure, but would make great sacrifices to cure if it only knew how. So I think he's right that this is something that democratic governments would want to cure. But the problem is that usually government intervention makes that worse, and makes roughly everyone, like everything else being equal, less wealthy. So if we don't want unemployment, the best thing is for the government to just stay out of it. Because the economy is a creative process, and when you mess with creative processes top down from the outside, then they tend to deteriorate. Like creative process you shouldn't try to mold or steer creative processes in a certain direction. It's generally a bad idea. The creative process tends to suffer from that. Okay. Continuing, our Western democratic societies are far from being perfect, but discussion of their faults is welcome in all of them, and practical steps to remedy matters are constantly being searched for and being taken, certainly more than ever before and certainly more than anywhere else. Yeah, this is why I think that this kind of pigheadedness when it comes to societies as a whole is actually better maybe in any given Western democratic society than it is in any given member of that Western democratic society. Like, you could basically discuss, I think you could basically discuss anything without being killed for it. I mean, there may be some exceptions, like maybe if you divulge certain government secrets or something, like the kind of stuff Edward Snowden did. Well, he might not have been killed for it if he had stayed in the U.S. He might just, I mean, I say just in scare quotes, he might just have been incarcerated. So maybe there are some exceptions, like if you really try to hurt the government or something, that you can get in real trouble. But generally speaking, just intellectually speaking, you can, in our Western democratic societies, you can speak of basically anything you want without serious fear of retaliation from politicians. Whereas if you try to speak to an individual about anything that individual considers taboo, that often goes south pretty quickly. So, something to think about. But I think there are also rationalities in groups that are where individuals are better. So I'm not saying groups are better than individuals necessarily. I'm just saying that when it comes to discussions of errors and like fixing those errors, it seems to me that sometimes the society as a whole is a bit more open to that than any particular individual, or most individuals. Continuing. Our Western democracies are the most flexible, the most anxious for reforms. The reforms I've witnessed in my lifetime amount to several social revolutions. Of course, we have made great mistakes, and some of them have not yet been corrected. Excuse me. Obviously, democratic public opinion is not always very wise, but there is an infinite amount of goodwill about it. Peace on earth and goodwill toward men. This is the hope of millions. I know nothing and I can prove nothing, but I believe that millions on both sides of the Iron Curtain would willingly give their lives if they knew that by doing so they could establish peace. Meanwhile, we have built up those institutions that have made freedom reasonably secure, and with it all those wonderful rights that we enjoy. I'm going to try to pronounce this habeas corpus. I had to look this up. It's basically protection against unlawful detention. A parliament or a House of Representatives to look after our rights and to help us defend ourselves if our freedom is invaded or merely threatened. Yes and no. So like I said earlier, the legislature also infringes upon our rights a lot, and we have only limited ways of protecting ourselves against that. A point that the Libertarian Party likes to make a lot on Twitter is that when the government points at like people like Putin or China or I don't know, North Korea, that those are the evil guys and that we have to fear them because they might come after us. Those people are really much less of a risk to us than our own government. The main violator of our natural rights is our own government, not Russia, not China, not North Korea or any of those places. Certainly Russia and China and North Korea and all those places would like nothing more than to see the United States crumble to bits. But that's not going to happen. Because they can't really... They can't compete with the United States in any meaningful way. We're much better than they are at almost everything. And the legislature and also law enforcement are kind of overrated. I mean, they've gotten a lot of flack for it, especially police brutality, and I think that's warranted. But also just in terms of like how helpful are they actually in day-to-day life. I mean, this is only anecdotal. It'd be good to see actual statistics on this, but like if I look back on any time I was the victim of a crime, and so like when I was a student in middle and high school, and my bicycle got stolen, I think twice. So I pressed charges against unknown, and nothing ever came of it. Literally nothing. I don't think if there was ever any investigation or anything. There was one time I was assaulted, and there was actually a video camera on the building in front of where it happened. And then the police said, oh, they can't let me look at the video camera because even though it was in public, there was like a concern for the privacy of everyone that was around. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. There have been other cases where like recently I had to press charges against someone for harassment, and they had some of my property that they just refused to release for the longest time, just refused to cooperate. In general, the cops just didn't really care. I don't know, maybe these are just my personal experiences, but I mean, the reason I think this is the case is that the cops get paid either way, as an institution. because of taxes. They don't have to do as good a job as a voluntary organization, where I could then decide to take my money elsewhere if they do a poor job. Another example, Square, the payment processor, they've repeatedly lied to their users about how soon they will pay out, they will give them money that they're currently holding. They typically say 90 days, and then they don't do it. They told me 90 days in writing, and then after like 100 days, I still hadn't gotten the money, so I emailed them and emailed them and emailed them. They just wouldn't do anything about it. And so I told the corresponding state regulators, and they're just like, I mean, they gave more reasons, more explicit reasons, but like at the end of the day, basically what their response amounted to was, we don't care. And there's the same problem again. I can't take my money elsewhere. There are no consequences for this. The only time it gets, like, elections maybe have some influence on this, but if I could vote with my money, if I could vote with my wallet, I could vote today. I could inflict consequences on these terrible organizations today. Whereas if I vote later, and then I'm only one vote out of millions, it doesn't really make much of a difference. So, yeah, the situation when it comes to law enforcement, I think, is bad. There's a silver lining there in that the legislature also passes way too many laws, and there's this old saying that, show me the man and I'll show you the laws that he has violated. So like this old notion that anyone is a criminal in some sense because there are just way too many laws to keep track of. So in that sense, it's actually a good thing that law enforcement seems to be largely incompetent and not really on top of things. But that's really just a silver lining. That's not a good situation to be in. Anyway, I forget where I was. Yeah, I'm just going to continue here. And especially the freedom to hold unconventional theories and to discuss them freely, in other words, toleration. It is plain that without toleration and freedom, pluralism would be impossible, and we would become a monolithic society without, or at best with, diminished flexibility. But toleration is also a necessary precondition for the East and the West to live together without destroying the world. Zakharov and others speak of peaceful coexistence, but during these past years, this combination of words has become debased. No one in the West can any longer hear these words without feeling that they have become a symbol of sheer hypocrisy. There's a nice story somewhere by Emerson about a guest in his house. He writes, the more he talked of honesty, the faster we counted our silver spoons. I'm afraid we all feel today that the more he talks of peaceful coexistence, the faster we ought to counter ballistic missiles. This is a most serious situation. We do not any longer believe in what Russia promises. It is a situation that is very difficult to reverse and which adds immeasurably to the danger of the nuclear arms race. The hope of establishing a state of peaceful coexistence was high in the West for a long time, because it was so obvious to us all that peaceful coexistence was the only alternative to total mutual destruction. Thus it was in the interest and the self-interest of both sides to be honest about peaceful coexistence. But our hopes were systematically destroyed. Russia exploited every opportunity to improve its military position at the cost of the West. But, what is infinitely more important, Russia continued to do so even after signing, in Moscow in 1972, a solemn declaration stating the basic principles of the relations between the U.S. and the USSR and promising that neither of the two powers would try to obtain unilateral advantages at the expense of the other. The Russian leaders must have known that to continue after this declaration with their earlier policy was a dangerous game. But it seems that they did not see the greatest danger, the destruction of our faith and their trustworthiness, and their capacity to be taken seriously as possible partners in a peace treaty. Immanuel Kant, a philosopher venerated by many and also by Karl Marx, foresaw the possibility of such a development. He discussed it in his marvelous essay on eternal peace. No state, Kant writes, ought to allow itself to commit those kinds of hostile acts that are likely to undermine mutual confidence in a future peace. This, Kant shows, is a sheer common-sense principle of self-interest. Since the future is never fully predictable, the violation of this principle can easily become suicidal for the transgressor. Yeah, I would say that this doesn't just apply to states and diplomacy, it also applies between individuals. So if someone, for example, you have a disagreement with someone, or they bring up certain grievances against you, and then they say, this is what you need to do to make it right, and then you do those things, but then they keep talking about those things. If you hadn't made them right, well then, what was the point? Like, why keep interacting with them? Because nothing's ever enough. Like, it's not going to matter. It's not going to make a difference. So they would, and Popper gets into this soon, like they would first, if they want to find some resolution, they would first need to demonstrate somehow that the previous things were indeed resolved and like adhere to previously agreed terms that they may have even suggested themselves. Continuing. So wrote Kant in 1795, before wars had become national wars with Napoleon, or total wars with Hitler, or nuclear wars with our own destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What's notable about this passage here is that this development of ever more violent and all-encompassing wars that is completely due to governments. I cannot imagine how anything like that could happen in a libertarian society. But nobody seems to really be aware of this, except for a few token libertarians here and there. And, yeah. I don't mean to sound cynical or pessimistic or anything, but if it does happen that there is an all-out nuclear war and total destruction of the earth, that will be because of government, because of the institution of government, and it will be because people did not learn how to live without it soon enough, in my opinion. Continuing, the disappearance in the West of trust in Russia's word was a lengthy process. The process was lengthy not only because of the typical inclination of democracy to believe in words of peace and to disbelieve or discount acts that belie these words, but also for more rational reasons. It takes some time to convince oneself that rational people are acting against their own obvious self-interest. Now the self-interest of all parties to avoid common suicide by universal extermination is obvious, and so is the self-interest of acting in accordance with Kant's principle. Was this? It doesn't let me click. Okay, discuss that. There is a school of utilitarians that says that morality is nothing but enlightened self-interest. I do not believe this. In fact, I think it is blatantly untrue, but in the present world situation, it is blatantly true that morality and the rational self-interest of the great powers do coincide with the establishment of mutual trust in each other's signatures. So, something to note about this passage is maybe Popper doesn't realize this, but basically what he's describing here is that there are certain dynamics that can exist between individuals and also between groups of people that kind of go beyond their legal structures and their governmental structures. Something that David Friedman, for example, points out is that repeat players in a market need to stay true to their words to be successful. This is Popper's whole criticism of Russia here. They repeatedly interact with the West, but they don't stay true to their words, so now we cannot trust them. And so this means that we're not going to be as mutually successful. There's going to be animosity, and if there's animosity, if there's fighting, if there's war, this is way more expensive than peaceful collaboration. And this is David Friedman's argument for why private arbitration services will tend to abide by judges' decisions, even in the absence of a government, because they are repeat players. If they didn't do that, nobody would want to do business with them. Did I write this here? I wrote somewhere about something about diplomacy. Maybe I'm going to say this again later, but basically, any contributions to the study of diplomacy are also contributions to the study of how it is possible to live with one another without government. Because diplomacy means you have representatives of one country interacting and cooperating and collaborating and signing treaties with representatives of another country. And this has worked for thousands of years, even though there is no government that encompasses all of them. So the world as a whole, this is the common libertarian argument. I think I learned this from Logan Shipkin. This is a common libertarian argument that the whole world is already in a state of anarchy. The whole world is already libertarian. So why can't people who live and individual countries be libertarian with each other. Like, it does work. It can work. We have evidence of this, empirical evidence. Now you could argue, well, but there have been atrocities in this alleged libertarian world, but then I would say, well, yeah, but that is because the world is only libertarian at the level of sovereign nations. And these sovereign nations have basically an infinite supply of money that comes from extorting their own people. This is the reason why they can afford war, even though it's so much more expensive than peaceable collaboration. Okay, I think I stopped here. 2 events led to the collapse of our trust in both the sincerity and the rationality of the rulers of Russia: the complete disregard of the Helsinki Agreement on Human Rights and the invasion of Afghanistan. After the invasion of Afghanistan, it was felt by everyone in the West that Russia's talk of peaceful coexistence and her solemnly signed agreements were parallel to Hitler's announcement that the Rhineland, then Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland, was definitely his last demand. Yeah, I think I read on Twitter recently that those lies by Hitler and by the Nazis is why the Nazis had to surrender unconditionally, because you can't make a deal with someone you deem untrustworthy. You can't have peace negotiations with someone like that. It's just over at that point. Yeah, and that issue comes up, like I said, not just between nations, but also between private individuals. I said this earlier, like, if you say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, or like, these are my terms, and then the matter is resolved, and then they don't actually abide by that, well then, okay, what are you going to do in the future? You cannot trust them anymore. So then there's no point in enter talks with such a person. With private people, that doesn't mean there's a war or anything like that, because you can't fight a war against a private person, nor should you. I'm not saying that, but like, the same trust issue arises. So it means you should just avoid repeat interactions with that person. Continuing, I do not know anyone in the West who is any longer interested in what happens at the Madrid conference. Treaties are no longer taken seriously. Yeah, this is basically the issue. If Russia wishes a reversal of this terrible situation, which did not arise in Lenin's or even in Stalin's days, only her acts, drastically different acts, will be able to achieve it. And this is what I said earlier. There is still a chance for someone to revive their image in your eyes if they previously broke terms. If they can still retroactively make good on that. Like, there has to be some show of that they've corrected that error, and then maybe you can interact with them again. Continuing, I think that Russia ought to have learned from Hitler's errors, and that the West ought to have learned from our own errors. The West gave in to Hitler many, many times. We wanted to convince him that we were ready without hypocrisy for what is now called peaceful coexistence. He took it for weakness, a fatal error, as it turned out, fatal for millions, fatal for him. So Hitler proceeded like Louis XIV, like the two Napoleons, and like the Kaiser, from victory to victory and from treachery to treachery. He had failed to learn from their mistakes. Yeah, this is an important part of fatalism. So you don't just have to learn from your own mistakes, you can also just learn from others' mistakes, and then you don't have to make yours in the first place, not always. Okay, this is the last page. The Russians, like Hitler's Germany, refused to be convinced of our sincerity concerning peaceful coexistence. They took it for weakness. This was a great mistake, and they are now on a dangerous path. If first turned away from this path, a turn that they should take in any case, not only in the interest of humanity but in their own self-interest, would be to fulfill what they had promised and signed in Moscow and in Helsinki, and reverse their policy toward the valuable and constructive criticism of the so-called dissenters, and stop the violation of human rights. So, here Popper suggests concrete steps that an untrustworthy partner in a potential collaboration could take to become trustworthy. The constant emphasis of Russia on our alleged hostility and on our alleged hypocrisy seems to be a relic of the most dangerous of superstitions, the belief in the predictability of history, more especially the belief in the historical inevitability of the triumph of communism, whether through war or through the piecemeal surrender of the West. At least some of the Russian leaders seem to be caught in this ideological trap or to be dazzled by this fantasy. Yeah, I wonder if that's the case for Putin too, because again, this was written before the war, before the Iron Curtain came down, but Putin did grow up in Soviet Russia, and he worked for the KGB, if I recall correctly, the Soviet Secret Service, I think it is. This would explain why they have forgotten, or rather repressed, the memory of our great alliance in the war against National Socialism and our fulfillment of our obligations throughout the war and at the end of the war. It would also explain why they have forgotten, or rather repressed, such events as the help rendered to Russia by the unforgettable Fridtjof Nansen, the High Commissioner of Refugees at the League of Nations. I remember as if it were yesterday how Lenin thanked Nansen for saving the lives of millions of Russians in the 3 years from 1921 to 1923. The help from the West was rendered at a time when revolutionary Russia was in a precarious situation, and when the class structure of Western society was very different from what it is now, far less equalitarian. I'm not sure what he means by that. Is that what people nowadays call equity? Anyway, nevertheless, it is clear that we in the West have made at least as many mistakes as those in the East. One of these mistakes is that in England and America we have forgotten Nansen, and we did not learn from our own fateful mistakes in our attempts to convince Hitler of our non-aggressiveness. Yet I feel certain that we can learn. An obvious first step, already much discussed, would be the refusal to cooperate with the Soviet Union in cultural and scientific matters, including, of course, technology. So, here Popper discusses actions that can be taken, like sanctions basically, much like the United States took against Putin in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There's a typo here. This says, not much discussed, but mush discussed. But maybe it's because this is a scan. There's a talk by a German, researcher, information security researcher, where he talks about, I think this bug has been fixed now, it's been 10 years since that talk was released, but there was a widespread bug in scanners. It was really fascinating. A widespread bug in scanners where the scanners wouldn't, in the software, the scanners wouldn't just scan a page pixel by pixel. What they would instead do to save memory is they would use shape recognition algorithms to recognize letters, say. And then so, for example, if you have the letter S, and here in this word discussed, you have the letter S 3 times. So instead of saving the letter S 3 times, it would say, there's a letter S on this page, and it occurs at these positions. The problem was that sometimes this shape recognition algorithm wasn't perfect, and it might say, mistake the letter C for the letter S, or something. Or maybe it mistakes a capital I for a lowercase l, or something like that. And then when you open up the page, when you open up the scanned version, it'll actually introduce typos, and it'll switch out numbers and stuff like that. And this was a big issue because there are historical archives, for example, in Berlin, I think, that had relied on this technology and had gotten rid of the originals, and now they had all these faulty scans. And you would think that a scan is foolproof, but it wasn't. Anyway, continuing. This would not be a counter-move to blackmail, but to use that florid language that they often use and which they therefore may understand, it would be a spontaneous demonstration of our solidarity with our suffering brethren in the East. I don't know what florid means, but I think what Popper is saying here is it's kind of a nod to the kind of collectivist thinking that goes on in the East. Whereas we in the West obviously have a more individualist school of thought, which is also why we're better and more successful than the East. But I also wonder if Popper is partly sincere here, if he does partly or partially consider people in the East our suffering brethren. And the reason I say that is because this notion still underlies what I think happens today with our efforts to help, or I say our, but the U.S. governments and the European governments help to Ukraine. I don't think the West has any obligations towards any citizens of the Eastern Hemisphere if they're not part of NATO. And I mean that moral or legal. I as I said earlier, you're definitely welcome to help Ukrainians voluntarily if you wish to, but don't force people to help them, which is basically what's happening in the West now. Your tax dollars are used, whether you like it or not, and sent to Ukraine. I think that's not right. Certainly ironic to speak of a fight for freedom there. I wrote an article about this on my blog. I think it's called Don't Be Fooled by Zelensky, because Zelensky made the speech in front of the UK Parliament where he said freedom will win. These are definitely things that the West likes to hear, because we believe in freedom, as much as our political institutions often violate freedom. So that speaks to this liberty bone that many of us have, this freedom bone that many of us have. But the reason it doesn't make any sense to speak of liberty there is because, for example, Ukraine uses conscription. You can't fight for liberty by violating it in the first place. If the very first step you take to fight for liberty is to violate liberty, that doesn't work. So there is this collectivist notion that the people in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine in particular are our brethren, and that we are our brother's keepers. And Ayn Rand's point is that we are not our brother's keepers, so we shouldn't be forced to help them. You're responsible for your own life. You're not responsible for their lives. But if you want to make it part of your life, if you want to help them voluntarily, go for it. Nobody will stop you. Continuing. I wish to end with an optimistic consideration. At least I've been somewhat cheered by it. Natural selection and selection pressure are usually thought of as linked to violence, to a more or less violent struggle for life. But all this changes with the emergence of the human mind, of the higher function of human language that permits us to formulate theories, hypotheses, and especially impersonal critical discussion. We may let our theories fight it out. We may, as I said before, let our theories die in our stead. From the point of biology and natural selection, the main function of the human mind, and especially of critical thinking, is indeed that they make possible the application of the method of trial and the elimination of error without the elimination of ourselves. In this lies the great survival value of the human mind and the human language. Thus, in bringing about the emergence of mind, of language, and of critical thinking, natural selection transcends itself and its original violent character. With the emergence of mind and human understanding, selection needs no longer be violent. We can eliminate false theories by nonviolent criticism. Nonviolent cultural evolution is, from the biological point of view, not merely a utopian dream. It is rather a possible result of the emergence of mind through natural selection. It is possible for us to make the leap from the world of necessity and violence into the world of freedom and peace. Peaceful coexistence is possible, and to bring it about remains our task. Our task is not merely to interpret the world, but to change it. Peaceful coexistence is what Sakharov wishes to bring about. We must support him in this task.